What will it take for the Jets to stick with Mike White as their guy at quarterback going forward? What will it take for the Jets to make major changes in their coaching staff or front office? What will it take for Woody Johnson to get involved? We will discuss all of this and more on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, December 28th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. It helps the channel out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. So does giving a big thumbs up if you're watching this show on YouTube. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Then this game's definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code LOCKEDON, all caps, in the game. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag show. It is our final mailbag show of the year 2022. Of course, it's far less dramatic than it sounds because it's December 28th. But thanks to everybody who sent in questions. And let's begin with a question about the status of the front office and the coaching staff. John, if the Jets lose their next two games and Mike White with Mike White and are non-competitive, do you foresee ownership making any front office or coaching changes? I think that with the botched drafting and botched development of Zach Wilson to go along with a 1-6 finish, it would demand some accountability. I have no idea what Woody Johnson's going to do. I have no idea what Chris Johnson's going to do. I think they've both proven themselves during their tenures to be erratic owners. So all I can tell you is what I would do. And I don't think there's any way I would make a change at either the coaching staff or the front office. Now, you could argue maybe a coordinator. This year it would be Mike LaFleur. Last year it would be Jeff Ulbrich. If you want to make a change there, I can live with it. I don't know that Mike LaFleur necessarily should go. I'm not saying Mike LaFleur is some genius offensive mind. I'm not saying he's been as good as we hoped he would be. But I think his issues stem more from just bad quarterback play than anything. And, people always talk about how a team develops a quarterback. Well, I think more frequently when the young quarterback fails to develop, it's the quarterback hurting the coaching staff. It's more the quarterback hurting the coaching staff than it is the coaching staff hurting the quarterback. There are always exceptions. I mean, you throw Adam Gase with a young quarterback, obviously that's not a good thing for him. But I don't know that there's anything inherently wrong with what Mike LaFleur has done. You look at the front office, well, it'd be a weird year to fire Joe Douglas because Joe Douglas just had an amazing draft class. And not only did he have an amazing draft class, I mean, he did sign DJ Reed. Joe Douglas's track record in free agency is kind of spotty, but I think, weird year to do it because, the team's obviously better. This is not just some paper improvement of the record. This team's legitimately a lot better. So I'm not sure you necessarily need to give anybody an extension right now. I'm not sure you necessarily need to say this is our guy for the next 5 years. But I've seen a lot of progress in it as far as Robert Saleh goes. I've been impressed with the job Saleh has done. I think he's dealt with a lot of situations that could have turned into major crises and handled them pretty smoothly. Now, he's got to finish. He's got to turn this thing around. The Jets do lose these last two games, and I don't like talking about it, but the Jets do lose these last two games. Saleh's got to answer for it. I don't know that it's necessarily a case, though, where firing somebody is accountability and not firing somebody is a lack of accountability. I don't like viewing things that way. And the other aspect of this is too frequently when we talk about whether a coach is fired or whether a coach stays in the NFL, we're looking backwards. Essentially, I don't like the idea of firing somebody as a punishment. I think you fire somebody because you determine they're not your guy, that they are not the right guy to lead your franchise forward. I think that's the point where you make a change. That's the point where you say, okay, we need to do something different. And sometimes that's shown when you're losing. If you're losing, maybe it shows you something that suggests this is not my guy. There's an inherent flaw in this guy that is going to lead him to not being successful with us. That's where losing should lead to firing. Too frequently, it's just a reaction to events that happen. And sometimes you stick with a guy, he'll be able to figure it out. To me, this is the first group I feel is competent running the Jets in quite a while. So while I'm not saying they deserve contract extensions, while I'm not saying that I think that they should be here the next decade, I do think they've earned another year, probably 2 more years, because you can see that this team is clearly moving in the right direction. So, and listen, I'm as frustrated as anybody. If you listen to my Friday podcast after the Jacksonville game, I was very critical, and I think that it's fair to be critical. I don't think it's a choice of everybody's out of here means that we're showing that this is unacceptable, or keeping everybody, and that means that losing is acceptable. It's not like that. But it's more, are we going to just completely go away from the path we're on? And I think the path we're on is moving in the right direction. Now, I could reassess that, the end of next season. I could reassess that at the end of 24. But for right now, I like the direction the Jets are going in. Do you think the team's moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? That's the question more than it is, ending the season losing a bunch of games a bad thing? Of course, ending the season losing a bunch of things is a bad thing. Of course, it's a mark against Robert Saleh, and it's even a mark against Joe Douglas. But it doesn't mean you have to fire people all the time. It doesn't mean that every time you have a losing streak, you have to fire people. It doesn't mean that there's a lack of accountability when you're not firing people. Now, the only exception to this is if the Jets could get Sean Payton. Listen, if the Jets can get Sean Payton, I think they should do it. As much as I respect Robert Saleh, and even if it means, Payton wants personnel control and Joe Douglas has to go, because that's a proven guy. But are we going to fire Saleh and go to another coordinator? Well, what's the point of doing that? I think that Saleh is probably as likely as any coordinator out there to have success. So I don't see what the point of making a move would be like that. And I think it would just be a purely reactionary move. I don't think it would be the right thing for the Jets to do. So I say, I don't think so. I don't think it should happen. Next question, John. I know you are on the record advocating signing Huff to a long-term deal. However, if the sides can't get it done, do you think another team would swoop in and grab him if he's on a second-round tender? So, yes, I'm an advocate of signing Bryce Huff to a long-term deal, and let me explain why that is. It's not just about the player. You have to think about what the contract the player is going to get. And with Bryce Huff, I feel like the conditions are in place for the Jets to get a really good value deal. So why do I say that? Well, he is an undrafted rookie who's played 3 seasons, so he's made practically no money. He's still a year from hitting the open market, because this year he's going to be a restricted free agent. So the Jets pretty much have control over him for another year. And while he's a good player, Bryce Huff's a good player, he has a bad 2023. His value is going to be finished because he is a situational pass rusher. So these 3 things kind of combine and suggest to me that the Jets are going to be able to work out a good value deal for Bryce Huff. Bryce Huff's probably going to leave money on the table to take some degree of financial security. So that's why I'm in favor of signing Bryce Huff to a longer-term deal. Now, if they can't do it, would a team give up a second-round pick? Because now if the Jets and Huff can't reach a deal, what happens is, as a restricted free agent, the Jets can offer him a 1-year contract. And depending on how much money that contract is, it depends on how much that tells you how much compensation the Jets get. So there's one level where you just get a player, you would get a draft pick. If the player signs with another team and you let him go, you'd get a draft pick at the round that player was drafted in. With Huff, you don't get any compensation because he was not drafted at all. So let's say Huff was drafted in the 5th round. With the original round offer, you'd get a 5th round pick. If it's a 6th round pick, you get a 6th round pick. If he's undrafted, you don't get anything because he wasn't drafted, because there was no round for Huff. The next level is you get a 2nd round pick in return. And I think that's what the question is. Would anybody give the Jets a 2nd round pick for Bryce Huff? I think the answer to that is no, because as good as Bryce Huff is, he's proven so far to be a situational player. I don't think anybody's going to give up a 2nd round pick for a situational pass rusher. Can Bryce Huff do more? Well, he's got to show more against the run. Now, I guess this is kind of like partially chicken and the egg because he only plays passing downs, but I don't know that he can hold up as well against the run just when you look at his skill set. So I don't think the Jets are getting a second round pick for him again. I think long term deal's the move because it's not just because I like Bryce Huff. It's just because the situation to me suggests Jets are going to get a bargain if they do this because Huff's the kind of guy who, because of his situation, is probably going to be inclined to leave money on the table if the Jets give him a good deal. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about another guy whose future is a bit up in the air, and that's Mike White. What does he need to do to earn the starting job for 2023? That's what we'll talk about as we continue this Wednesday mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by a new sponsor, and it's an exciting new sponsor, Ultimate Football GM. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Well, your dream can come true, and this game's definitely for you. You can manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You are responsible for hiring the right coaches and coordinators, trading players, making draft picks, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft, and all the ups and downs of the season. This is a challenging game and a realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. And Locked On Jets listeners can get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in the game store. That's Locked On in all capital letters. It's one word with no space. LOCKEDON, again, all capital letters. So make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This show's free and available on all platforms. We continue with our weekly mailbag. Our next question. Hey, John, love the podcast. My question is, if White performs well these next few games, would you have him as the 2023 starter? If not, how would you address the situation? Draft, sign a free agent like Jimmy G? That's a great question. I don't know that White can necessarily guarantee the starting job the next 2 weeks. But if he plays poorly, I think he can guarantee that he won't be the guy in 2023. I think there's a lot that's up in the air with Mike White. So let's say he plays poorly. Then it's over. There's no shot the Jets can bring him back as the starter in 2023. If he plays well, then he's got a shot. But I think the Jets owe it to themselves to look at all the options out there. And if there's one that really makes sense for them, then I think they have to take it. The thing with that, though, is I've done this in the past couple of weeks. I don't really know who the good option is. Do you want to pay Jimmy Garoppolo over $30 million? Jimmy's a quality quarterback, but man, he can't stay healthy at all. Do you want to potentially give up, a first-round pick or multiple first-round picks for Derek Carr? Because that seems like, of the quarterbacks who are realistically available, he seems like the most likely and the best one. That's one I'd have to think about, because I do think there's something to the idea that adding a Derek Carr-type quarterback to the Jets, it could really raise their ceiling when you look at this defense. Maybe he's not a guy who can lift the team on his own, but you put the right pieces around Derek Carr, and Derek Carr has never had the right pieces around him with the Raiders. Maybe there's something that could happen there. But short of that, it's tough. It depends on how good Mike White looks. But I think you'd have to consider it. And here's the other point I want to make is the only way out of this is through the draft. And I know I've seen people say they don't want to draft a quarterback. And I'm not saying the quarterback has to be the pick in the first round. Because something, you think this through, a lot of the mistakes the Jets have made at quarterback are because they put themselves in a position where they felt like they had to draft somebody. That's where it was in 2009 after Brett Favre retired. They really didn't do anything. They tried to trade for Jay Cutler that year. But, they went to the draft and essentially felt like they needed to draft a quarterback. The entire 2018 draft was pretty much built to draft a quarterback. They pretty much set everything up that for a full year, needing to draft a quarterback in 2018 and not knowing which quarterback they were going to get. And the irony is that I think that, Sam Darnold did not work out, but I think they were actually, at the time, it felt like Darnold was going to go number one overall to Cleveland. I think at the time they were trading him for Baker Mayfield, which probably would not have worked out either. And then 2021, obviously, after they traded Darnold, they were sold on Zach Wilson, but it kind of felt like they put themselves in a position where they felt like they needed to draft a quarterback. So I'm not necessarily saying the Jets need to draft a quarterback by all means, but I think you have to be aggressive. I think the only way you're going to find a top-notch quarterback, a difference-making quarterback, is through the draft. if there's somebody there sitting when you draft in the first round, you got to do it. You may even have to move up for this guy if he's good enough. But I think you also should look in round 2 and round 3. Look at the prospects there. And I think one of the things White could do for you if he's good enough is buy you time. I always think back to Kansas City, the Kansas City model, which was they did not draft their quarterback immediately. They went and got a guy who could play in Alex Smith, a guy who could keep the team afloat. And that essentially bought them time where they did not need to draft a quarterback, where they could wait for the perfect guy to fall to them. And then once they got the perfect guy, they could wait for him to be ready to insert him into the lineup. And that would be like the best thing Mike White could do for the Jets. And so, I think you got to stay aggressive. I think you got to go. There was a legendary GM, Ron Wolf, who had a philosophy: you draft a quarterback every year because it's the most important position. And Wolf's philosophy, and I agree with it, is it's the most important position on the field. Yet teams don't do anything to give themselves multiple options. The teams don't give themselves out if Plan A doesn't work. It's like they stick with Plan A, and that's it. There's no other options. So I think you should look to draft a quarterback, and if White plays well enough, then I think it's a good thing for the Jets. If you make a bigger move, if you make a move for Derek Carr, you probably don't draft somebody round 1, but you can still look round 2, round 3 for a guy with the traits you're looking for. Again, I'm not saying you have to draft a quarterback, but I'm saying there's a guy who's, when you're up, who's got the skills you're looking for, who you think you can develop, then I think you look to draft him. And I think almost unless they make a Derek Carr type move, you got to look to draft somebody this year. If it doesn't work out, if nobody's when you're picking, if nobody really matches the grade you're looking for, then fine, you don't do it. But I don't think I think too many times teams just put themselves in the mindset we're not drafting a quarterback early no matter what. And I think for the Jets that would be a mistake. I said this yesterday. If White doesn't pan out, I don't really know what the Jets do at quarterback in 2023. I think it's a tough spot because there are not many good quarterbacks available. So I think you got to hope Mike White pans out for the Jets. Will he? It's tough to say. And one other point I'm going to make, because I've heard this name thrown around the internet a couple times, the Jets are not going to trade for Aaron Rodgers. Look at the Green Bay situation. Green Bay's not going to trade Aaron Rodgers. It'd just be too much dead money. It makes no sense for Green Bay. When Green Bay signed Rodgers to that extension, that was it. He's their guy going forward. So put that one out of your mind. Aaron Rodgers is not going to happen. And of course, this video will be played back all the time if the Jets do trade for Aaron Rodgers. But I just don't see that as a viable option. I think, I don't think he's an option. But as far as the other choices go, if White doesn't pan out, I really don't know. I think the Jets are in a spot where White panning out really solves a lot of options, and aside from my thought that they need to go through the draft. Our next question about Jeremy Ruckert. What's been the deal with Ruckert this year? Has he been hurt, or do they just not think he's ready? Wasn't he supposed to step right in as a blocker? Where's the logic in taking this guy in the 3rd round? With their lack of a running game and pass protection, could he not help a lot? Well, I don't think the plan was ever for Ruckert to play this year. I think that they drafted him as a developmental guy. Well, he was a 3rd round pick, but 3rd round picks usually don't play. I think this is one of the areas where there's kind of a disconnect between analysis and reality. I see a lot of people in the media say, "Well, this guy's a 3rd round pick. Why is he not in the lineup?" Well, look across the league. How many 3rd round picks are seeing significant snaps? It's not a whole lot. So I don't. And they signed 2 tight ends in free agency, so they brought in 2 veterans to play. So Ruckert, the plan was never for Ruckert to see significant snaps this year. And the one time he did, he didn't play very well. He dropped a pass. I think the Ruckert was the developmental player, though. I never agreed with the people who said he was going to he was ready to step in as a blocker immediately. I thought his blocking at Ohio State was very inconsistent. I thought the technique was not there yet. I thought it was going to take some time for him to develop. I think it's too early to write off Ruckert. I was not expecting big contributions from him this year. Now you can say, well, these tight ends have not been very good. Why is he not in the lineup? I don't know that it's necessarily a knock on him, though. I think this coaching staff and front office are higher on these tight ends than I am, and maybe you are. So I need to see more time before I'm ready to completely write off Jeremy Ruckert. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out our weekly mailbag, and we'll talk about everybody's favorite topic, ownership. Is there a chance Woody Johnson could get involved? Is there a chance Woody Johnson could meddle? Well, I'll tell you what I think as we continue on this mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Audible. Audible is releasing a slate of new football podcasts that we're sure you're going to love. And that's why you'll be able to find an episode from The League available as a bonus episode on Locked On NFL. Narrated by Super Bowl champion and legendary smack talker Richard Sherman and sports broadcaster and rising star Taylor Rooks, The League is an 8-part docuseries about the most bizarre, inspirational, and unlikely stories connected to America's favorite sport, pro football. You will not want to miss those untold stories spanning the 1940s through the present. Our bonus episode is called The Way of the Cowboys, and it's the incredible story of how the 1977 Dallas Cowboys brought on Bruce Lee's protege to teach their defense martial arts, ushering in a new approach to the way the league trained. Each story offers equal parts history, entertainment, and social commentary. And head over to Locked On NFL for a bonus episode of The League, or catch the full series wherever you get your podcasts, available now. Audible, get in the game. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. Here is our Wednesday mailbag show, our final Wednesday mailbag of 2022. Our next question, John. The Jets have had incremental success and generally seem to be in a much better spot than they were even 3 years ago. One of my big fears is Woody Johnson will eventually start making football decisions in terms of coaching or player personnel. This is shown to be catastrophic in the past. Do you think Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh have done enough to keep Woody Johnson out of the way of the day-to-day operations of running this team? Well, as I said earlier, I'm not going to predict what Woody Johnson's going to do, but I tend to agree. I think it would be a disaster if Woody Johnson got involved. Now, here's one thing that I think does help the Jets now is the structure of the organization has changed. Joe Douglas now reports directly to Woody Johnson, and Robert Saleh reports to Joe Douglas. So it takes some influence away from Woody Johnson, because I think when the head coach and the GM are both reporting to you, you get more power, because what if there's a disagreement between the two of them? Then you're making the decision as owner. It's funny because I spent many of the early years of the show, this was a big complaint among the fan base when the coach and the GM were both reporting to the owner. I spent the early years in the show kind of defending it because it's not that uncommon of an arrangement. The early years of the show, people were talking about the Jets are the only team that does this. Well, the Jets weren't. It was a very common arrangement to have the owner running the show, to have everybody reporting to the owner. The problem is you need an owner who knows what he's doing. And I think it's clear the Johnson brothers don't know what they're doing. I'll say this for Chris Johnson. Chris Johnson, while he was running the team, it was a catastrophic run. He had no clue what he was doing. And worse, he didn't realize he didn't know what he was doing. It's one thing to not know what you're doing and, realize it and say, you know what, I got to get some help here. I better be careful. Chris Johnson was completely reckless and impulsive in his early years. I think his failures, though, especially the Adam Gase hire, kind of humbled him. That's the impression I get with Chris Johnson. But Woody's Woody. And I don't even know, we don't even know how Chris Johnson's going to handle this. I think it would be a disaster. And, the problem is people see something like this. And there's been a couple of recent articles out. Jason LaFleur had one that, Woody Johnson's not happy with Saleh. Woody Johnson's not happy with LaFleur. I think there's a tendency, if you don't like LaFleur, to be happy with this new news that ownership could interject. Well, it's not really thinking long-term, having that viewpoint, because Woody Johnson has no idea whether Mike LaFleur is good or not. The people running the team are the ones who have an idea whether Mike LaFleur is good. You'd much rather have Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh making decisions than Woody Johnson, because over the long run, if Woody Johnson's making the decisions for you, you're going to have a lot of mistakes. You're going to have a lot more bad than you're going to have good. Even if he stumbles into a good decision, it's not because he knows what he's doing. It's just because he lucked out. So you don't want Woody Johnson making major decisions for this team. I think it's a bad, it would be a bad omen. I don't know if I believe the stories that have come out. I think that, these are rumors that always fly around this time of year, so I'm not overly worried about it yet. Again, I have no idea what Woody Johnson, I'm not going to predict what Woody Johnson's going to do, but I would say it would be a very bad thing for the New York Jets, in my opinion, if Woody Johnson started getting more involved in the football decision-making. Our next question, what would it take next season for you to view Jermaine Johnson as a success? Well, I come more and more to believe when you look at his play and you look at the Jets' financial situation, Carl Lawson's probably going to be a luxury the Jets are not going to be able to afford to have. $15 million cap hit. I don't think he's going to be able to stick around because Jets are going to be relatively tight up against the cap, and that money is going to really be able to help the team. When you look at the defensive line depth, I don't think Lawson's enough of a difference maker to keep him around at his current salary. Now, if he takes a pay cut, maybe we could talk about it. So I think Jermaine Johnson has to step into that role and play well. And, if you want a number, I'd say maybe, I don't know, 7 to 8 sacks. I don't think the Jets need him to be a impact. I don't think the Jets need him to be an all-pro. I think they need him to be a good player. The threshold's always lower at a high-value position like edge rusher, because if you get 7 to 8 sacks a year, you're really helping your team out. So that's the threshold I have. The one caveat there is that, at the time the Jets made it, over the last couple of years, the Jets have traded up a lot. Johnson was the only one I was a little iffy on because they gave up a lot to get him. So, they passed up some good opportunities. I mean, there were some linebackers the Jets could have taken with one of the picks they traded to get Jermaine, who really would have helped them at this point. So that's the one thing that makes me a little iffy. But I still tend to think if Jermaine ends up being a good starter, that's always worth a lower first round pick, and that's where the Jets drafted him. So, and if you even to the picks the Jets traded, I think they traded a 2 and a 3. If you get a quality starter with one of those picks, I think you've done quite well for yourself. So I think that would probably be my threshold with Jermaine is, a quality starter, quality impact guy. I think that's probably where I would go. Our next question, what would it take for the Jets to get rid of Mike LaFleur? And this was asked by like 3 or 4 different people. Anything could happen. I mean, I think that the offense stumbling, you could justify getting rid of LaFleur. But I go back to what I said earlier. I don't think LaFleur is the problem with this offense. And, every time a non-Zach Wilson quarterback's played the last 2 years, you've seen the offense move the ball better. So I think Jets issues, sometimes the issues are not about your quarterback. I think Zach Wilson's issues are more, I think the Jets' issues are much more about the quarterback than they are any other spot. And that I don't think that was necessarily true, 3-4 years ago. I think it's true now, though. I think that the quarterback position has really held the Jets back. And if the Jets got any sort of quality quarterback play this year, they'd already have a playoff spot clinched. And part of that's the schedule, but I don't know if LaFleur is really the problem. So I don't know. I think that he could be fired. I think based on this year, he could be. Obviously, a bad last 2 games where the Jets don't move the ball with Mike White would increase the odds of him being fired. I don't think he deserves to be fired, though, and I think that he'll probably be back next year. Follow-up question, what would it take for Chad Pennington to replace LaFleur? Well, that one I can answer easily. Chad Pennington's not going to replace LaFleur. Chad Pennington does not want to coach in the NFL. How do I know that? I did an interview with Chad Pennington last year on Locked On Jets, and he told me, and I asked him, do you want to coach in the NFL? He said, I will never coach in the NFL. So that one's an easy one. Our last question, do you have any Jets gear? If so, prove it. I really don't have a ton of gear. I've got a couple old jerseys. I got a Pennington. I've got a Revis. I got a couple shirts. I got some flannel Jets pants. I think I have like a Curtis Martin card that's a playing card that's like in a case, but I honestly don't have a ton of. I have a Jets reusable shopping bag, but I don't have a ton of that gear. But as I mentioned, I'm on the road this week. I'm visiting family in California, so I can't prove it. So sorry about that. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Hope you have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back again tomorrow. We'll talk Jets Seahawks. It'll be crossover Thursday here on the Locked On Podcast Network.